All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our latest Student Life Advisory Board professional development session. Today, we are lucky to have Kori Hennessey with us, who is the Director of Education and Programs at the LGBT Center of Raleigh. And Kori's going to talk with us a little bit about creating inclusive spaces on our campuses, which I know is something that we're all striving to do and try to do it better than we did it last year. And Kori's going to talk to us a little bit about basic terminology, pronouns, and why they're important in affirming our students and our colleagues. So Kori, I'm going to give it over to you.
All right, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Awesome, perfect. Okay. All right, so I will check the chat box after I'm kind of done, but I definitely want to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions and whatnot. But feel free to type in whatever you need so that, you don't forget your questions. But yeah, I wanted to just kind of go through a little bit of some basic information, terminology, and just ways to affirm your students and how to be supportive. So just a little bit more about myself. Again, my name is Kori. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I am the Director of Education and Programs at the LGBT Center of Raleigh. I have actually finished up a nonprofit management program at Duke University now. I got to update that. I am also a certified facilitator trainer with the Transgender Training Institute. I have my bachelor's in psychology from Valparaiso University. I live in Raleigh with my 3 dogs and a partner. I enjoy lots of art and kind of being involved in that world. And I'm also currently converting a 20-year-old camp van into a camper with my partner now. So I just like to throw fun things in there to make me seem more like a human. But it is a process. So if anybody is looking to do that, let me just tell you it's a lot of work. But yeah, so just to get started, I just want to start with some basic statistics to kind of put things into perspective. Approximately 5.6% of US adults are all part of the LGBTQ plus community. This was a study that was done just last year, and it has been gone up since the year 2017, 2018, which was about 4.5%. And this is just done by surveying a large number of individuals and kind of figuring out where the percentage of people lie. LGBTQ plus obviously covers quite a wide range of individuals. That's like sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. To put this percentage into perspective, there's approximately 18 million people. So, that percentage might not seem so big, but whenever you think about the number of people, it is quite a lot of people. So whether you, think you might not know someone or ever meet someone that's within the LGBTQ plus community, I can guarantee that you will. There's lots of people out there that kind of identify in different ways. To give you just a few North Carolina statistics, about 4% of North Carolina's population is part of the community as well. I kind of broke it down and gave you a little bit of idea to see some of the disparities, because that, kind of helps people think, okay, well, why do we have to worry so much about the LGBTQ population? They're no different than anybody else. It's just dependent on, who they're attracted to, right? Well, that's not true. There's a lot of disparities that happen. Technically the LGBTQ community is, it's a marginalized community. There's a lot of oppressions that happen, especially whenever you layer in different identities. So we're talking about, just general statistics as far as like where the LGBTQ plus community lies compared to the general North Carolina population. You can see that there's some striking differences between things such as employment, insurance, food security, and even income, basic income. So, when you look at all these things and you kind of, start to realize why people in the LGBTQ plus community need more help, more support, and why there should be a focus on kind of creating policies and laws and spaces that are safe and affirming for individuals. Talking about Raleigh specific, I know not everybody in this group is specific to Raleigh, but this is something that I like to mention, just being the capital and being the LGBT center of Raleigh, and being a big area. This is where we kind of lie within that like percentage. We are the 5th lowest percentage of the adult population, as far as like, where some other areas, bigger states, bigger cities, etc. might be. This could be due to a lot of different things, but for anybody who might know about the Municipal Equality Index, this comes out just about every year, and you can kind of see where some of the North Carolina towns and cities are compared to each other. So Raleigh received fairly low. It has been increasing, which is good, but it's only a little bit every year. So compared, Raleigh receives 64 out of 100 compared to a place like Chapel Hill or Cairo or even Greensboro that's in the 80s. Of course, then there's lower areas like Cary, which is, they don't really participate in this, so that kind of tells you something. So there's a number of things that get taken into consideration with this, which includes legal protections, housing, other programs, hate crime laws, representation, and even as far as like positions held in different areas, and not just necessarily in policy. So as you can see, yeah, the numbers, 2017, it was fairly up there and then kind of dipped down and went back up a little bit. And so I think that people are kind of starting to open their eyes and realize that some of the things that need to happen. However, as we have seen with this non-discrimination order, for anybody who does know or is familiar with that, there's multiple towns and cities that within North Carolina that have adopted this and taken this on, of this non-discrimination order where LGBTQ protections are specifically named within that. Raleigh has still not gotten there yet. And this is something that is needed, but we had to convince, the city council and the mayor and everybody above that to do that. Or realistically, the governor to just, do the whole state at once. That'd be great. So talking a little bit about terminology. So here is at this point in time these days, this is about the most common acronym that you'll see, LGBTQ+. Some people in this group probably, are very familiar with this, probably know everything that it means. Others don't necessarily. So I like to, kind of do some basic covering of this to make sure that, everyone is kind of on the same page. So of course it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and then the plus, there are other identities and other labels and words that people use to identify themselves. That can get really confusing really fast for people who are not completely familiar with the community. So that's not something that we really have time to dive into today. But I definitely encourage you to kind of continue educating and learning about, what some of those identities mean. So just kind of covering sexual orientation. I think most people at this time do understand what that means and where some of those, identities are held. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, those are all sexual orientations. So that is realistically, who you're attracted to, what kind of behaviors, you're exhibiting as far as with other individuals, and, as far as your sexual identity, those are some of the words and identities that you hold. So this is something that, as I'm kind of going through the rest of this presentation, you have to remember that this is something that is completely separate and something that everybody has. So everybody has a sexual orientation. And you can kind of think about yourself, if it helps, maybe kind of writing down some of these things about yourself. What is your sexual orientation? Kind of leaving that in one separate area. And then also, just making a note at the bottom here, it's really important when we're talking about language to avoid saying the word preference. So it's whether it's sexual preference, preferred pronouns, preferred way of X, Y, and Z, right? Because that implies that this is a choice and that it can easily be changed. That's not true. That is something that is, been very, very obvious, in many ways for a very long time, right? So it's really important whenever you're talking about and with individuals to kind of avoid using those terms and kind of moving away from using the word preference. So gender identity. So, I talked about a little bit about what sexual orientation is. That is your sexual orientation. That's who you're attracted to. That's who you are as far as, who you are as far as what is the term? The easy way to put it is who you go to bed with, right? Gender identity is something that is completely separate. This is more like who do you go to bed as? Gender identity and sexual orientation, and I will repeat this probably multiple times, they are completely separate, and they don't necessarily influence each other, right? So you have a sexual orientation and you have a gender or gender identity. So gender identity, just think about yourself. That is basically the concept of yourself. So, the majority of people in this world typically identify as man or a woman. However, people in the LGBTQ plus community, that's where the T and sometimes the Q and some other identities come into play, right? So transgender individuals, non-binary individuals, those are examples of gender identity. And so that's just the concept of who you are, how you feel in your own heart and in your own mind, what makes you feel good about yourself, whenever you're thinking about things, you're thinking about, okay, how do I want to present myself? How do I want other people to view me as, what pronouns do I want to use? What kind of name do I identify with? All of those things kind of go into play with your gender identity, and everybody goes through this. It's not just people in the LGBTQ plus community. It's really, really important to remember. So that's just, again, if it helps, keep kind of putting this into perspective, thinking about yourself. So, gender identity is a person's, concept of themselves. A person's gender identity may not align with their sex assigned at birth. When we talk about sex assigned at birth, that is just what the doctor said when you were born, right? So again, gender identity, it does not equal sexual orientation. Those are not, those things do not, those things are not the same, but it's also important to know that your sex assigned at birth can be different than what your gender identity is. And so hopefully I'm, kind of putting things into like, okay, if you're writing things down onto a piece of paper, put one side sexual orientation, gender identity, and then what the doctor said when you were born, your sex assigned at birth, essentially. So that's, just the M or the F on your license, or, the XX or the XY. There are other iterations of that, but to keep it in simple terms, your sex assigned at birth is basically just hormones and your sex characteristics and your genitalia and things like that whenever you were born. Your gender identity is not related to your sexual orientation, again, and it also does not determine someone's sexual orientation. So just because you might be transgender does not necessarily mean that you're gay or lesbian or bisexual or anything like that. So just remember, all of these things are separate. So talking a little bit more about gender and gender identity to kind of help you understand this concept a little bit more. Gender and identity, it's basically something that is socially constructed. It's something that society has always influenced, from day one. Babies are born, you get, a pink hat or the blue hat, right? Things are changing now, but, for anybody who is a little bit older, does kind of understand some of these things, right? Girls are supposed to play with certain toys. Boys are supposed to play with certain toys. Also things of like how you dress, how you wear your hair, all of these things go into play when you're talking about your gender identity. And it is all things that society has influenced. Gender also has internal influences. So again, when we're talking about how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about, how other people view us, something that, that makes us feel comfortable in our own heart and in our own mind. It can include and influence external expression. So again, kind of talking about the clothing, hairstyles, mannerisms, all those things that, you do to kind of express yourself on the outside to other people. And gender is also spectrum. There's people that are all over this, line. There's people that can be in those boxes at each end, that man box and that woman box, right? But most people are honestly kind of in that line of, somewhere in the middle, maybe on one side, closer to one side or than the other, depending on, how you feel, again, how you feel about yourself. But there's a lot of things that go into gender and gender identity and who you are. What it's not is, it's not just binary man or woman. Non-binary people exist, and we'll talk a little bit more about that to kind of, help you understand what that is and how people identify that way. Gender identity is also not just, it's not genitalia, it's not hormones, it's not sex characteristics. What that is your sex assigned at birth. Okay, so that's important to remember. Your gender identity is not based on how your body is. So everybody has different bodies. Everybody has different body type. Everybody has different things going on within their body and on their body. So it's really important to know that, your body does not determine who you are. And so a lot of people might argue that is, is not the case, that depending on what genitalia you have will depend on, who you are, what your gender it is. That's not true, because remember, sex assigned at birth is very separate from gender identity. Your gender identity is not based on how you express yourself either. So, again, you might feel like, okay, well, I agree with the doctor. The doctor said that I was a boy when I was born. Makes sense. I'm, growing up, I feel like a boy, but, I like to wear makeup sometimes. That's totally okay. You're expressing yourself, but wearing makeup is, remember, it's something that society has said is more for women. So again, it's, gender identity is not based on how you express yourself. So, we hear a lot about, kids kind of just exploring who they are and maybe trying on different clothes and playing with different toys and doing all these different things, right? That doesn't necessarily determine anything about who you are. It's just, that's how you express yourself, right? And again, your gender and your identity itself can change throughout life. So think about yourself now, think about yourself 10 years ago, think about yourself when you were a kid, right? There's probably a lot of things that have changed. And some of those things are probably things that are considered, how you identify with your gender. So hopefully some of these things have kind of helped, understand that what gender identity is, and what gender identity isn't. To talk a little bit about transgender individuals. This is something I think that people start to get a little bit more confused with and have a little bit harder time kind of grasping the concept of what transgender means and who a transgender person is. So essentially, a transgender person is a term that's used to describe a person whose biological sex and gender identity are incongruent, or essentially they don't match, right? So it's an opposite of what a lot of people identify as. So the majority of people in this world identify as what is called cisgender. So cisgender is a person who, again, the doctor says it's a boy, you grow up and you say, yep, the doctor was right. That makes a lot of sense. I, identify as a boy. My gender identity is boy, man, male. So that means that you're cisgender. That's the majority of the people in this world, right? But transgender individuals are basically the opposite of that. The doctor says, the baby is born, it's a boy, but the person starts to grow up and says, I don't really feel like a boy. This is not who I am. And it causes a lot of distress. There's a lot of mental health issues that can come from that. There's a lot of other issues that could come from that because people are trying to follow what society is telling them to do, what the family is trying to tell them to do, what the doctor is telling them to do, right? Instead of listening to themselves and doing what is the best for them and what is the most comfortable for them. So if you're thinking about, how like, what does transgender mean, or how do I know, whenever someone tells me they're transgender, what am I supposed to think, right? Basically just thinking about yourself, and thinking about how to identify, and then knowing, a transgender individual does not match basically what they're assigned at birth. So this is going to include, transgender men, transgender women, non-binary people, and other genders that don't necessarily match what they were assigned at birth. I kind of put some 2 definitions down here because, the easiest way to start thinking about it is start thinking about what does it mean to be a transgender man? Or what does it mean to be a transgender woman? And so you can kind of read, those definitions, and understand, okay, transgender man is someone that, was assigned female at birth, but, that's not who they are. That's not how they identify. A transgender woman is essentially the opposite, is, someone that was born male at birth and is like, no, that's not right. That's not me at all, right? So it's really important to know what those definitions are and what words go with those definitions, because some people can get them confused, and are really unsure of, what words to use based on, how a person identifies. So talk a little bit about non-binary, because this is something that's even harder for people to understand, which is totally okay. It is totally okay to, really struggle with some of these things, because our human brains are wired to essentially try to put people into boxes. So non-binary individuals essentially they're not in boxes, right? People that, identify as non-binary or gender fluid, or, maybe some other words that you might have heard, they basically reject the idea of gender, essentially. So it's people like, for example, myself, right? I identify as non-binary. I use they, them, theirs pronouns because growing up, I think about all these things that I've done as a kid and as I grew up and even into adulthood of like, I don't really fit into any box, right? Yes, I kind of like to present as more masculine. That's what I feel comfortable doing. I like to have shorter hair. I like to, kind of wear pants and shirts and things like that typically men are known to wear, right? But I've never really liked being put in boxes. I've never saw myself in any sort of box. I kind of just see myself as something that's just essentially in the middle, right? That's it. There's a lot more to it that, is going through my mind and any non-binary person's mind. However, the easiest way for anybody outside of that to understand is really just to understand that, individuals that identify as non-binary, gender fluid, or anything like that, those are people that, really just don't kind of adopt that like strict male or female, either or kind of mentality, right? So essentially, I just want to be me. I want to be human. I want to be treated as just another individual. I don't want to be told, oh, well, you were born this way, or you know, dress this way, so therefore you have to do these certain specific things, right? Just like, you know, back in the 50s and before, right? Like women were supposed to stay at home and cook dinner and take care of the kids, right? All of those things that that, you know, essentially society said that women had to do, versus men who were supposed to be the breadwinners and the care, you know, the I take care of my family, but I pay for things, I go to work, you know. So obviously society has come a very long way from that, but we are still very, very, very far from making this a safe and comfortable place for anybody who is essentially outside of the binary or non-binary gender fluid, right? So, you know, it still might be really hard for you to kind of grasp that concept, and that's totally okay. I'm just kind of here to try and, you know, essentially give you some of the definitions and put things into perspective a little bit. So talking about pronouns, this is really, really important for especially some of the work that you're going to be doing, you know, working with students or other colleagues, or, you know, just anybody within the community schools that you work. Pronouns is something that everybody has and something that everybody should be using, right? It shouldn't just be transgender or non-binary individuals. Pronouns are things that everybody should be talking about. Why does that matter? Because you should never, you never assume somebody's pronouns. If you're assuming people's pronouns, or, you know, making mistakes because of the way that someone is dressed or because of the person's name, right? You are making assumptions that essentially kind of send a harmful message. Or really, I mean, you could be making an assumption and, you know, making an assumption and then, you know, making a mistake, and then feeling like uncomfortable or embarrassed, or, you know, somebody could get really mad. Like there could be a lot of things that happen, right? So the best thing to do is to talk about pronouns. Even if you are a person who, you know, is cisgender, so remember that is, you know, you were born, the doctor says, this is who you are, and you say, yeah, that makes sense. Even if it's something that you don't have to think about, and it's something that you think, oh, well, shouldn't it be obvious that I use these pronouns? That is not the case for everybody. And sometimes it comes down to a safety issue for a lot of individuals. There's a lot of people that are very hateful within this world. If they find out that, you know, you are transgender or non-binary, and, you know, somebody sees maybe your license that's not updated, or if somebody thinks, oh, well, obviously they look like they're transgender and that makes me really uncomfortable, so I'm going to get mad and I'm going to hurt them. This does sometimes come down to safety issues. So making sure that you're using the right pronouns for people kind of alleviates some of that. Obviously, whenever we're talking about they, them, theirs pronouns, that is still something that isn't widely understood or adopted yet. So there's already that kind of level of unsafety already, but a lot of people who use those pronouns do understand that. So sometimes, you know, you have to have conversations with people, right? Having conversations with someone and say, like, I really want to make sure that I'm respecting you and I'm keeping this a safe place for you. So please share your pronouns. What pronouns do you want me to use? This is my name. These are the pronouns that I use. There's a lot of different things that you can be doing and that you should be doing to make it a very affirming and safe place for everybody. And then also too, think about people who might have gender neutral names. So, you know, example, my name is Kori. Kori is used by people of all genders, right? So if people make an assumption that I use a certain set of pronouns and I say, that's not right. Like you don't want that to happen to you, right? So just thinking about, okay, well, in my email signature, I should put my pronouns to make sure that people understand how to refer to me as. It's something as simple as that. And then again, it can be something as important or concerning as, you know, a safety issue for individuals. So just to talk a little bit about some action steps to take, essentially just ways that you can support your students, support your colleagues, support anybody that you may be working with or around. Consider looking into campus policies. What are your policies? I mean, this can be, anything from, how do we address bathroom situations? How do we address if someone has a safety concern or some sort of other concern on campus? This could be something as your non-discrimination order. So, do you, or your non-discrimination clause, do you have it very specific that you accept people of all different gender identities, gender expressions, sexual orientations, race, culture, religion, et cetera, right? So those things should be very explicit and very, laid out to show that you are accepting, of all individuals, and you want people to come to your schools. This could also include residential policies, for anybody who might have a situation or be in a school or setting that may have some sort of on-campus residential life or anything similar to that, right? And this, again, could go into the bathroom situation, locker rooms, anything that, may involve people's kind of personal lives and, personal things happening. What are your policies and practices? How do you deal with an individual who might be transgender, who is just going to the bathroom that they identify with, that they feel comfortable going into? How do you deal with someone who might be upset about that? How do you deal with a parent who might be upset? Obviously, majority of your students are adults, legally adults. So hopefully you're not interacting too much with parents, but you will, parents, families, etc. So those are, really important things to take into consideration. What is the visibility and ease of prospective students and staff finding inclusive policies? This includes, information on your websites, social media accounts, going into like the info center or the help desk, or like the student unit or any place like that, where it's like, the first kind of people that you interact with whenever you're coming onto campus. All of these things are really important to show that you are inclusive, you have inclusive policies, you really want people to come on to your campus, you want diversity, and you are, there for everyone and not just one type of student. Competency of current staff at all levels. This is really important, and I really applaud all of you that are here today to kind of just hear me talk a little bit about some of the basic information that you can take away. But what's really important is to still think about some of the people who don't really have much experience or, might kind of still be in that, well, I'm not really sure. I don't want to necessarily discriminate somebody, but my personal, beliefs and things kind of prevent me from accepting this quote unquote lifestyle, right? You'll hear that word a lot, lifestyle. What's really important to talk about is you're here for the students. You're here, this is your job. You need to leave your bias at the door, right? That is the case for anybody. Nobody wants to be, harassed or discriminated against whenever they're just there to learn or just there to do their job, right? So this may, require a more, formal, more in-depth training to really understand and discuss some of these things. So it's really important to think about and to consider kind of, having more opportunities for people to learn on all different levels. This is not just, teachers or, TAs or, things like that. This is also the presidents and the people that are in the higher ups, in the different offices, in, even on the boards, right? So this is really important to, have everybody kind of be in on the conversation. Campus resources, obviously, this includes things like making sure that if you know that you have a student that's dealing with something, you can send them to the appropriate places. What's really good and even better is having an LGBTQ specific space or a center within your campus. NC State has something like this. I know Central has an a center on their campus. There's a lot of spaces in other campuses. So it's really important to potentially have some of these, because you may have individuals that are here from a different state or a different area that don't know anybody else, and they need to find their people and their community where they feel safe, right? So it's things like that. There's a lot of other things to consider. Representation of staff, making sure that you are considering, hiring other people for positions that don't necessarily fit in with the majority of what your staff look like, right? So if you have the majority white staff, definitely consider, potentially trying harder to reach out to communities of color, LGBTQ plus communities, people of, different types of cultures, different religions. Everybody kind of brings in a different perspective, and that enriches your campus, and I think I don't necessarily have to explain it. I feel like a lot of people do understand that concept, but it is really important, not just for the culture of the campus, but also for the students. If the students there, don't necessarily see themselves represented in the staff, they're not going to necessarily feel the most comfortable and feel the safest, especially if they have an issue. They want to go to the people that will understand what they're going through, right? It's really, really, really important. And then, of course, visible signs of acceptance and inclusion. So this is, June is Pride Month. Obviously, most schools, are out of session, or maybe there's just, some summer classes happening. But maybe consider having, events or other things that celebrate certain days, or that, commemorate certain days, really, including some of those visible signs, having rainbow flags up, people that, want to be shown that okay, I'm a safe person to come to and talk about some things, or I can help you with resources. I'm not going to judge you, maybe in making some sort of visible sign there. And as well as, again, talking about pronouns in your email signatures, pronouns on your name badges, making sure that your paperwork is inclusive. So asking people, what pronouns they use, asking people if they have a name that they, like going by that isn't necessarily the name that's on their identification. So a lot of things to consider. And a lot of things that, again, there are people that you can reach out to. Myself, right? Like, I do a lot of these things. I do help people going through some of these processes, different businesses, organizations, right? Or if you're in an area that is closer to another LGBTQ specific space, maybe reaching out to them and saying, hey, I really need help with this. Do you have someone that can help me, right? There's a lot of resources. There's things that you can do if you don't know where to start. You can bring people in to help. But it's really important that being an ally isn't the one and done thing. There's lots of work. There's always work to be done. There's always things to improve on. And so it's really important to continue educating yourself, continue working towards trying to just make this a more affirming and inclusive world, realistically, for everybody. So that's it. And we have good timing for questions, discussion. And I will leave this slide up just for a little bit for anybody who wants to copy down my information. And I'll go ahead and pull up the chat to see what kind of questions we have. So someone asked, is there somewhere on a website where we can read this for various areas? Are you talking about this? I think you're talking about the statistics.
Yeah, Tiffany posted that when you were talking about statistics.
Yeah, so there's, so if you look up the Municipal Equality Index for North Carolina, you will easily be able to find it, and you'll be able to find the different information for North Carolina. Some good places to go and look for other information. You can go to the Williams Institute, has a lot of different research things that they have posted. So that's a really good one to look into. But hopefully that helps answer your question. A helpful tip for hiring: there's LGBT specific hiring events that you can let know that you are hiring. This will get your position. Yep. That is true. Yeah. Would you talk a bit more about how using the wrong pronoun is a safety issue? Yes. So I can give an example. This is kind of a personal example. I went back to my hometown at one point with my partner. I am from a fairly small area in Indiana, which is a red state, not a very open state. The area that I, am from doesn't have very much, right? There's not a whole lot of resources. I didn't grow up with any resources. People are nice, but fairly closed-minded. So there was at one point, my partner and I were with my parents, who are still working on things. They mean well, but they're still working on things. We went to a restaurant that served alcohol, right? My partner had ordered a beer, and they had asked for their license. And so at the time, my partner hadn't updated anything on their ID. So, the person looks at the license and sees that there is a specific gender marker there, right? But then my mom is talking while the wait staff is there and starts using the wrong pronouns for my partner. And that kind of just, both my partner and I looked at each other and were like, how's this going to play out? Anything could happen, right? In some areas, people will get kicked out. People will start getting harassed. If anybody around the area may have heard the situation go down, and then the wait staff decided to start gossiping about it, that can become a really dangerous situation, right? We could have left and somebody could have followed us because they are, hateful, homophobic, etc., right? So that's just an example of what can happen. A lot of people may, know the issues that come about every year. We have a day that's called Transgender Day of Remembrance. It's essentially a day where we remember and honor and, try to celebrate and uplift the lives that have been lost due to violence. So any transgender individual that has recently been killed in the last year, every year those numbers grow. This year is already set to be the most deadly year for transgender individuals. Situations that come up aren't always necessarily due to pronouns, but there can be situations that people get put in whenever it comes to using the wrong pronouns. And then people will say, I don't like that, I'm going to do something about it. So hopefully that kind of, helps people understand why this can be a safety issue. So I think that, it's really, really important to continue. Again, everybody should be talking about pronouns. Everybody should be sharing their pronouns.
Kori, I have a question and a comment. So this is JJ at the system office, and
Yep.
I'll be the bad guy in the room for a little while. One fact that I know for certain is that not all 58 colleges have LGBTQ organizations or safe spaces for students. And so part of my question is, some of our colleges are in fairly highly conservative areas where those types of groups just hard to establish. And so I'm trying to think of ways to arm our professionals here with how to support students. Also, our system does not allow in the admissions process for students to indicate their pronouns at all 58 colleges. There are some colleges that are piloting ways for students to use a preferred name as well as their pronouns during the admissions process, but that is not something system-wide. And that is not a practice that all of our colleges are following. And so again, sort of a general question is, how do we aim professionals here on the line to support students in that way, or push for those types of changes to be made?
Yeah, so in areas where it's not necessarily, I'm sorry, my dog is panicking right now. I'm just gonna hold. He doesn't like whenever they do yard all the maintenance work in the back, so I have to hold him to keep him calm. So yeah, in areas where it's more conservative, it's harder to kind of establish something that's a little bit more public. I certainly would encourage those professionals that might be on this call to, when you know that you encounter an individual that is within the LGBTQ plus community, or you have students that are maybe somewhat comfortable talking about it, but aren't necessarily like completely out in the world about it, right? If there's somebody that comes to you and that basically disclose to you that that's how they identify, right? It's really important that you as individuals, they show that you are a good person to come to, show that you're a safe person to come to, because word spreads, right? So any individual that's within the community that has a good experience will tell others, right? There are lots of groups that, we share resources amongst each other, and we basically share reviews of different things. So, there's often times where I will go on and say, I need to find, someone who's going to be trans affirming, whether it's medical, or whatever, right? So making sure that we're all staying safe. So, that is going to be one of the most impactful things. But you as that person also should be essentially, quote unquote, armed with resources, right? There are a lot of national resources that can help individuals. I know that you work with college age students, but some good things to consider kind of having on hand, information to having on hand is information about the Trevor Project or Trans Lifeline. There's a lot of things. It's really just kind of, again, Google is your friend, looking up different resources, national resources. So if people are having issues, they have things to look up online, they have numbers to call. That is probably going to be the best thing that you can do, because most likely there's not going to be any physical resources within that area that you're in. Of course, if someone is in that area and they have transportation and you get to places like Raleigh or Durham or Charlotte or even into Maine, Asheville, then definitely make sure that those people know about those resources. So I think that those are just some of the most important things to do. And to talk about kind of, not every college being on the same page. It's going to take work, but I think it's going to take probably, just sharing experiences and sharing, information, sharing statistics and saying like, look, like, this is why it's important to have these things. And it might not go well. But you may reach that one person that says, well, maybe I should think about this a little bit more. That's all we can do. That's all you can do, is just advocate and keep pushing to try and make change. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Somebody put in about Durham Tech Spectrum aimed at helping other NCs, community colleges establish these. Okay, yeah. Yes. Yeah, there are definitely, and that's too, that is something too, like reaching out to campuses that already do have established groups, and saying, okay, how did you do it? And then maybe kind of brainstorming different ways of, how you can still keep it safe but accessible to any student who might need it.
I'll ask one more question, just because I'm curious. Are there any programs or things that colleges do that are more harmful than beneficial? Or are there things that we should stop doing that we think are beneficial that probably we had a good heart, but the intent may not come across well? I guess I'm trying to think of, some of the, traditional things that, colleges sort of do for students. And then, what are some things that may be a better option to try as opposed to some of our golden oldies?
um, that's a good question. I think I'll have to think on that one a little bit. I think it's probably just dependent on what are some things that you have to, like, so examples, of like, I know that, again, and this is, I kind of already said this, but maybe things like, okay, you're trying to pilot asking for pronouns or things like that, making sure that, again, you're moving away from using that word preference. That's one thing. I'm trying to think of other examples that I would definitely love to, like, continue exploring this, because that's a really good question.
So, I guess a few examples would be obviously, celebrating the Heritage Month, bringing in speakers to talk about different avenues, bulletin boards, flyers, bringing in, professors or book reading, like shared reading, things of that nature. I guess, I don't want to always assume that the programs we're doing are beneficial. I want to make sure that, they are received in the way they are intended, and that always has positive messaging and in that respect. So I don't know. It was just a question that I guess I've always wondered.
Yeah. Well, no, that's great. I think that the more visibility that you're showing, so, talking about some of these things and actually bringing in, the right facts. So again, whenever, you're talking about some of the, like, those heritage months, or, okay, Pride Month, right? Pride Month was essentially started because the end of June, there's the annual day that commemorates Stonewall. So making sure that you have all the right facts is really important, and making sure that, I think something that people tend to miss the mark on is they bring in some of these speakers that may be considered self-experts on these topics, but the best people that can speak to some of these things are people with lived experiences. So if you're bringing in, somebody to talk about transgender issues or transgender day of visibility or anything like that, right? You're going to want to bring in someone who is a transgender, right? But also, obviously considering someone who is, holds that identity, but also, it is experienced in kind of speaking on some of these topics. So it's hard to find, but if you do your research, then, it definitely is the better way to go about some of that stuff.
Hi, Kori. This is Eddie.
Hey.
I'm the DEI student life specialist here at Gaston College. I really appreciate you today and coming on and sharing. Thank you for being so informative. I did have a question. A lot of students that I speak with sort of have a conflict between wanting to be identified and being respected for their gender, and how they identify, but don't necessarily want to be identified for their sexual orientation. They feel like it's a little intrusive. So have you sort of recognized that conflict before, or any suggestions towards that?
I can see where people are coming from, because when you're talking about gender and gender identity, that tends to be a little more visible. And so that does affect things like your pronouns and your name. So that is something that people are like, well, I'm going to talk more about it because I want to be respected. However, with your sexual orientation, that is not something that's necessarily, it's not visible, right? And tends to be a little bit more personal to people. I think that's totally okay. And I think that as long as you are, respecting how people want to kind of express themselves. So I know that, as an example, something that we have to do with some of our programs in order to get funding and to, get all the proper stuff that we need for grants and things like that, we have to provide specific data, right? And so we ask questions like, what is your gender identity? What is your sexual orientation? Whatever, right? But we also have to realize that sometimes people don't want to disclose that, but it's okay. So I guess it probably depends on like the context of like what's happening and, what you're doing. But I think it does make a lot of sense of why people, are like, okay, this is my gender identity because it's visible, versus it's not really many people's business as far as, sexual orientation. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. And just to give you a small little follow-up on that, for us moving forward, do you think that it's something that we might want to strive to get away from, is the whole sexual orientation identity component to it? And I mean, because we don't ask a heterosexual question, right? You know what I mean? And from that perspective, so I've never had to answer that as a heterosexual on any form or any piece of paper or anything in regards to that. So I always feel like it's kind of a double standard, but that's just my personal opinion. But what do you think from a cultural standpoint? Is it something that you think would be beneficial to move away from?
I can see again why it would be beneficial to know, because you're wondering, what kind of diversity you have as far as students coming in. But I think that if it's things that you don't necessarily have to be asking, because you're right, like, most heterosexual individuals don't have to answer that question. Again, the same with most cisgendered individuals don't have to answer that question, right? But I think it's still important to talk about gender identity and again about pronouns more than sexual orientation. But if it does affect certain things, like for us, funding and grants and things like that, then of course there's certain things. But as long as you're kind of leaving that disclaimer of, okay, we have to ask, like, be very explicit and be very honest of like, we are asking these questions because X, Y, and Z, but this information will stay confidential. You also don't have to answer, however it might look, as far as what context you're asking in, is also important.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely, no problem. Yes, LGBT history is in October. That's right. And it's true. Actually, most of the time, I only see people caring about the month of June. So I really appreciate that, Tiffany. Really appreciate that. I love it whenever people are, a little bit more cognizant about other communities outside of the quote unquote month, the celebrated month, right? Or the heritage month. Because it's, we're all here all the time.
So JJ and I have been having a little bit of a side conversation in a chat about something he mentioned earlier about pronouns, and some schools were maybe piloting ways to let students indicate those pronouns during the admissions process. And I was asking about that because I know at our institution, students can indicate pronouns, but it usually isn't available to them to indicate those pronouns until they've already made it through the application process. So there's a gap there where we could be using the wrong pronoun.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering if there's anybody who's doing, if you're an institution who is collecting that information, could you send me a message after the presentation and let me know how you're doing that? Because I'm really interested in how you're doing that. And I would also, if anybody knows if there's been any kind of conversation with CFNC about whether or not we could add that to our application process so that we're not having to collect it separately and we're getting it from the get-go and we're using the proper pronoun from the start instead of there being a gap, please let me know after the fact because I'm quite interested in this now.
Yes. And can I talk about traveling students and how we can respect students with room assignments and pairings? That is again kind of down to the application process and the acceptance process and just having conversations with students because, you know, I think that even with, you know, heterosexual cisgendered students, you know, there may be certain things of like, I don't know, I have allergies to this, right? So you have those conversations typically with, you know, everybody else, but having the conversations with individuals that are, you know, trans, non-binary, whatever, making sure that you're asking them what is the most comfortable to them, right? And then also making sure that you're having conversations and knowing what other students are comfortable, because you definitely don't want to put pairings, people together of where they have very opposite, you know, beliefs or, you know, identities that could cause a lot of harm. Trust me, I've been in that situation. It's not fun. You definitely don't want to have things like that happen. So again, I think it's about, you know, what kind of questions you're asking. I mean, talking about asking pronouns, asking what people's pronouns are and asking about gender identity, especially whenever you're, you know, you have a place where people are coming in and ask and, you know, are going to be assigned to a specific room for residential or more. So if you know that you have a student that marked down that they are transgender and they use he, him pronouns, but maybe their birth certificate, you know, says something else, then you know that that is a person that you want to have just an, you know, a safe and comfortable conversation with. And that, you know, could look a lot of different ways. And that is definitely something more that, like, if you, you know, want to explore that and want to kind of know the best ways to do that is it's a great time to bring someone in kind of help you through that process.
Yeah, I think so. The reason why I asked this question, I think everybody is itching for the opportunity to once again travel with students and take students to conferences and experiences and things of that nature. And so, you know, just making sure that, again, that they're, you know, respecting the student and, you know, making them feel welcome and trying to be as inclusive as possible in their plans and considerations.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other questions?
Christy asked what might be the best way for us to ask questions on a form or on an application about pronouns.
So, so just, you know, on any form, I mean, you just like how you know, are asking for people's names, you just say name, what are your pronouns? You could have, yeah, you could have, you know, like check boxes if people, because some people don't necessarily know how to answer that question, especially if it's something that you don't think about every day. So you could have, you know, boxes that say he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, or other, right? The most three common ones are those three pairings. So that's totally fine. Again, the same with like gender identity question. You could have, this is maybe a little bit more like in depth and maybe something that if you want to reach out to me, I can kind of give you examples because it probably would be easier to see. than me to explain it. But yeah, that's thank you for asking that.
Excellent. Well, do we have any more questions at all for Kori? Going once, twice, done. Kori, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great. It's been a really informative presentation today, and I hope you had a good time with us.
Yeah,
But,
great.
so if anybody has any questions for you after, where can they find you?
I did have my email up on that last slide, but I will go ahead and put it in the chat as well. That is the best way to get a hold of me.
When I send out the recording for this, do you mind me sharing your page on your website with them?
Yeah, go for it. Totally.
Okay, cool. All right, well, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.